Welcome back to botany class. In the previous class, we discussed biotic factors. Today, let's discuss ecological adaptations. So, today's topic is ecological adaptations. So, first question, what's meant by adaptations of organisms? It means the modifications of the structure of an organism to survive successfully with its environment is called as adaptations of organisms. So, what's meant by adaptations of organisms? The modifications of structure of the organisms to survive successfully with its environment. So, the adaptations helps the organism to exist under its habitat. Based on this habitat and the corresponding adaptations, the organisms are classified into different types. They are hydrophytes, xerophytes, mesophytes, and halophytes. This classification based on the organism's habitat and the corresponding adaptations. The habitat and the corresponding adaptations, these organisms are classified into 4 different categories. They are hydrophytes, xerophytes, mesophytes, and halophytes. So, today we are going to discuss about these two, hydrophytes as well as xerophytes. What are hydrophytes? You all know the hydrophytes plants. Here there are some hydrophytes. These plants are aquatic organisms. These organisms are aquatic, hydrophytes. So, what is meant by hydrophyte? The organisms which are living in water is called aquatic organism or hydrophytes. So, these all organisms live only in water. So, this habitat is called as hydrophytes. So, these hydrophytes are subdivided into different forms. There are several subdivisions of hydrophytes. They are classified into free floating hydrophytes, free floating. So, first hydrophytes are the aquatic organisms. These organisms are subdivided into free floating hydrophytes, rooted floating hydrophytes, submerged hydrophytes, rooted submerged hydrophytes, and amphibious hydrophytes. So, hydrophytes are again classified into free floating hydrophytes, rooted floating hydrophytes, submerged hydrophytes, rooted submerged hydrophytes, and amphibious hydrophytes. First, you learn the classification, very important question. Hydrophytes and its adaptations. Free floating hydrophytes. When you look at into the ecosystem, aquatic ecosystem, so here you can see a small aquatic ecosystem in the form of aquarium. Here there are different types of hydrophytes. They are free floating hydrophytes, rooted floating hydrophytes, submerged hydrophyte, rooted submerged, as well as amphibious hydrophytes. These free floating hydrophytes are the organisms which can freely float on the surface of the water. Here you can find several species. This is one of the free floating hydrophyte, Eichhornia and Pistia. Eichhornia and Pistia are the free floating hydrophytes. This is Eichhornia and this is Pistia. free floating hydrophytes. So these floating hydrophytes completely float on the surface of water. So this organism, these two organisms, is completely floats on the surface of water without attachment of the soil. In the pond ecosystem or in the freshwater ecosystem, in the pond or pools, in the basal part there is a soil or mud. But these free floating organisms do not have any attachment with the mud. So these are based on its retained in between the air and the water. So air, water as well as soil. These organisms, free floating organisms, do not have any connection with the soil or mud. So they have the association with this air and the water. It's not contact with the mud. They are called free floating hydrophytes. Example, Eichhornia and Pistia. Eichhornia and Pistia are the free floating hydrophytes. Then rooted floating hydrophytes. These do not attach, the roots are not attached with the mud, freely float on the surface of water. But rooted hydrophytes, rooted floating hydrophytes, there are some other hydrophytes which are rooted in the soil. So there is an example, Nymphia and Nilambo. Nymphia and Nilambo, that is lotus and water lily. The rhizome or the basal part which is attached with the mud, and the leaf and the flowers floats on the surface of water. So leaf and the flowers float on the surface of water. The root part which is rooted in the mud. Such kind of organisms are called as rooted floating hydrophytes. They are known as rooted floating hydrophytes. Then submerged hydrophytes. This submerged hydrophytes completely immersed in water. There is no contact with the air. So it is immersed in the water, submerged hydrophytes. This submerged, example, Utricularia. Here one species is there, Utricularia. Utricularia. This organism is Utricularia. This is Utricularia. So it's submerged hydrophyte. There is no contact with the air. It is immersed in water. No contact in the air or as well as the soil or the mud. They are submerged hydrophytes. Another submerged hydrophyte is there, rooted submerged hydrophytes. Very familiar example, Hydrilla and Vallisneria. These are submerged hydrophytes, Hydrilla. This is Hydrilla. The root is attached in the soil. Root is attached in the soil, but there is no contact with the air. It's submerged, immersed within the water. But root is attached with the mud. So, rooted submerged. Vallisneria as well as Hydrilla are the example of rooted submerged hydrophytes. Another example, amphibious hydrophytes, Ranunculus. Ranunculus, amphibious hydrophytes. So these hydrophytes, this amphibious hydrophytes have the habitat of aquatic as well as terrestrial. So these hydrophytes are showing amphibious organism, which shows two different habitats. This amphibious plants, hydrophytic plant shows two different habitats, aquatic as well as terrestrial. So it lives in the shallow water. the depth of the water is very less. In the shallow water, half of the part which is present in terrestrial form, in the soil, outside the aquatic ecosystem, and the other part is inside the water. So, amphibious hydrophytes. So, first hydrophytes, first classification based on this ecological adaptations and the habitat. Adaptations and the habitats, the plants are classified into hydrophytes, xerophytes, mesophytes, halophytes. Hydrophytes are the organisms which are living in water. What are hydrophytes? These are the organisms which are living in water. They are subdivided into free floating hydrophytes, rooted floating hydrophytes, submerged hydrophytes, rooted submerged hydrophytes, and amphibious hydrophytes. Examples are very important. These all examples and the classification. Now, the adaptations. How the plant's body is or parts of the plant is adapted to its environment to live successfully. So, these all adaptations, there are three different forms of adaptation you are going to learn based on the morphological adaptation. First adaptation, morphology. Morphology. Morphological adaptation, anatomical adaptation, and physiological adaptation. Physiological. Morphological adaptations, anatomical adaptations, and physiological adaptations. The plants shows adaptations to live successfully or survive successfully with this environment based on morphology, anatomy, and physiology. What are the morphological adaptations? Under morphological adaptation, you may observe the plants, its root, morphology. Normally the plants, the morphological characteristics of the plants is root, stem, and leaf. So, in these plants, these aquatic plants, all this classification, free floating, rooted, floating, submerged or rooted, submerged or amphibious plants, the root in aquatic plants or these hydrophytes, the roots are poorly developed. See here, this is the poorly developing root compared to the mesophytes. These plants, the roots are poorly developed. The roots are poorly developed and sometimes the root may absent. There is an example, Wolffia. In Wolffia, roots are completely absent. So, aquatic form Wolffia completely absent, roots are completely absent. Poorly developed roots in Hydrilla. In this plant, Hydrilla plant, these are the roots. Poorly developed roots. Roots are poorly developed. And this ranunculus is the plant, the root is well developed. So, when you write about the root morphological characters, the root completely absent in this Wolffia and poorly developed in Hydrilla, submerged hydrophyte, rooted submerged hydrophyte, and well developed in ranunculus. Then what about the stem? The stem is long, slender. If you see the stem of this Hydrilla, it's long stem. Stem is very long, slender and flexible, the stem. But look at this stem. Here the stem is very thick and in Pistia stolon is present. Here there is stolon. This part is stolon. So, these all are coming under stem part, stolon. So, propagation also takes place by this stolon, offset as well as this. And in the root there is a specific character. The root cap is replaced by root pocket. here the root which contains root pocket. This is the root pocket. Root pocket. In hydrophytes, the root cap is replaced. Other plants, in the mesophytic plants, root cap is present, which is replaced into root pocket. The stem is long, slender or stolon stems are seen in this plant. What about the leaf? The leaves, entire leaf in the floating, when the leaves are float on the surface, here it is entire leaf. Floating leaves are entire, and these leaves, hydrilla, the leaves are small leaves, and sometimes it is very poorly developed in Utricularia and some other forms. Then thick and leathery leaves in Eichhornia. So different structures have seen in the root, stem and leaf. These all modifications are morphological adaptations. So this structures helps the plant to survive well within its habitat. Then what are the anatomical differences? Anatomical adaptations. In this hydrophytes, anatomy, look at this diagram. This is the structure of tiers of hydrilla stem. This plant, transverse section of hydrilla stem. So in this, the stem, how it develops? Cuticle is completely absent. Cuticle is absent, and epidermis is made up of a single layer of epidermis, and the cortex is made up of parenchyma cells. These cells are known as parenchyma cells. Here is the air chambers. So due to the presence of this air chamber, it gives buoyancy to freely float on the surface of water. So air chambers, this is one of the adaptations of this. And this is endodermis and pericycle, and the vascular tissues are poorly developed. The vascular tissues are poorly developed. Their xylem and phloem is poorly developed. In the emerging forms, it is well developed. In the beginning of the stage, it's well developed, but later it's poorly developed. So this is then pith is made up of sclerenchyma. This is the anatomical adaptations of hydrophytes. Then physiological adaptations. What are the physiological adaptations? Physiologically, these hydrophytes are withstand in anaerobic conditions, because the plants which produces or possess some aerobic structures. So it can withstand anaerobic conditions. That is the physiological adaptations. So these all questions are important: morphological adaptation, anatomical adaptation, as well as physiological adaptation. Physiological adaptation 2 more question, anatomical adaptation 5 more question. Draw this diagram and write the points. When you draw this diagram, you can study all the parts. So you can write it as a 5 more question essay. Then anatomical adaptation, then morphological adaptation also. Write about root, stem and leaf. Sometimes it may ask for 5 more question. Next classification is xerophytes. What are called xerophytes? The xerophytic plants are living in dry condition. So based on this dry condition, the xerophytes, there are 2 different kinds of dryness: physical dryness, physiological dryness. Xerophytes. In xerophytes, there are 2 different: physical dryness and physiological dryness. What's this physical dryness? In physical dryness, the soil has the low water content. Because of reducing rainfall, there is less amount of water in the soil. Less amount of water in the soil, that is physical dryness. So the plants, the soil contains less water. The holding capacity, water holding capacity is less in the soil. Due to this, that the plants or the species are in dry condition. Physiological dryness, the soil contains sufficient water but the plant cannot absorb due to the salty nature or the acidic soil. The plant cannot absorb water. That is physiological dryness. So based on this, physical dryness and physiological dryness. Then based on the adaptations of this, the plants, the xerophytic plants, or what are xerophytes? The plants which can live in dry condition or xeric condition. So based on this, dryness, physical dryness, physiological dryness. Now what are the adaptations? Based on the adaptations, it is again classified into ephemeral, succulents and non-succulent. 3 different categories: ephemeral, succulent and non-succulent. These ephemeral plants, example tribulus. These are short living plants. The lifespan of these plants are very short and it is not a true xerophytic plants. Succulent plants, example opuntia and aloe. Opuntia, aloe are the examples of succulent. So these plants store water in its parts. This is the example aloe, succulent xerophyte. So in its part, the part in this leaf part, it stores water. So that is succulent. That is succulent xerophyte, opuntia as well as aloe. The non-succulent. Non-succulent xerophytes, example Nerium and Sisyphus. These organisms faces dryness internally and externally. So this non-succulent plants faces dryness internally as well as externally. So based on the adaptations, this xerophytic plants are classified into ephemeral, succulent and non-succulent. Now what are the adaptations? The adaptations, you can write about morphological adaptation, anatomical adaptation as well as physiological adaptations. What are the morphological adaptations? What about the root? Under morphology, we can write about root, stem as well as leaf. In xerophytic plants, the root system is well developed than that of the shoot system. Shoot system is poorly developed. You know this xerophytic plant, aloe. Shoot system is well developed, but root system is well developed than the shoot system. Most of this xerophyte, opuntia, this plant, opuntia, the root system is well developed. It goes very deep into the soil in search of water. So compared to this shoot system, the root system is well developed and root cap is present. Well developed root cap is also well developed. And the stems, the succulent plants which are modified. The stem portion which shows modifications of stem. There are different modifications. They are phylloclade, modifications of xerophytes. They are phylloclade, phylloclade observed in opuntia, cladode and phyllodes in acacia. Phylloclade, opuntia, cladode asparagus. So, asparagus, the modification is cladode. So, stem part modified, the aerial part is modified in such a way, phylloclade, cladode and phyllodes. So, stem portion, the stem is thick, the stem part or this aerial part is thick, leathery and coated with wax. And this phylloclade, what is the adaptation observed in Opensia? So, in this plant Opensia, this is the stem part. The stem is modified as a flat structure and perform photosynthesis. Stem modified into flat thick structures and it performs photosynthesis called phylloclade. Example, Opensia. So, here the leaf is reduced into spines. These are the leaves. Leaves are reduced into spine. The stems are flattened and green in nature, performs photosynthesis. That type of modification is called as phylloclade. And cladode, asparagus. In asparagus, two internodes are modified into flat-like structures called cladode. Example, asparagus. And phyllodes, in acacia, here phyllodes. This petiole is modified. Here the petiole is modified into flat leaf-like structure and the leaves are reduced. This is the natural leaf. The leaves are reduced in size and this is the petiole. Petiole is flattened, phyllodes, acacia. Now, when you write about this modifications, morphological modifications, stem modifications, these three questions are important. Modifications of Opensia, asparagus, acacia. 2 more, 3 more question. This is important. Phylloclade, cladode and phyllodes. Phylloclade observed in Opensia, cladode observed in asparagus, phyllodes observed in acacia. This is stem modification. Succulent plants which store water in its aerial parts, either stem or leaves. What about the leaves? The leaves, in most of the cases, the leaves are reduced into spines. These are spines, reduced into spines. And Sisyphus, in Sisyphus, Jujuba and Nerium. In Sisyphus, the stipules are modified into spines. The stipules are modified into spines. Here, stipules, this part, which is modified into spine in Sisyphus jujuba. Sisyphus, Nerium also, in all the leaf part is reduced into either spine or the entire body is covered, stem and leaves are covered with hair-like structures to reduce transpiration. Then what are the anatomical differences? Look at this diagram. This is the example of tears of Nerium leaf. Anatomically, what are the adaptations observed in xerophytes? There is a thick cuticle. The first layer is cuticle. Thick cuticle which is completely covered with waxy coat. Thick cuticle and multi-layered epidermis. The epidermis is multi-layered. And the mesophyll. Mesophyll is differentiated into the first cuticle, epidermis. In between this, the center part is mesophyll. The mesophyll is differentiated into palisade parenchyma and spongy parenchyma. This part is made up of palisade parenchymatous cells. They are elongated or cylindrical cells with lot of chloroplast. Chlorophyll is present here. Palisade parenchyma. Spongy parenchyma, next half is divided into spongy, which is made up of spongy parenchyma, and these are loosely arranged cells. So mesophyll is differentiated into palisade and spongy parenchyma. Another example, the stomata, sunken stomata. In the lower epidermis, sunken stomata is seen only in the lower epidermis, which contains number of hairs. In the sunken pit, this is the pit, sunken stomata, sunken pit, which contains the hairs. And this is the lower epidermis, and this is the cuticle outer to the lower epidermis. Sunken stomata seen only in the lower epidermis. So this is the adaptation observed in xerophiles, anatomical adaptations. One more adaptation, physiological adaptations. What are the physiological adaptations? Physiologically, the xerophytic plants are designed, the physiological processes or number of physiological process takes place within its body of the organisms or the plants. So physiological process are designed to reduce transpiration. Transpiration, what's meant by transpiration? The excess amount of water comes out of the plant from its aerial part to avoid transpiration. These are xerophytic plants. They are live in drought condition. So these plants, to avoid the evaporation, the excess amount of water, to avoid transpiration, this rate of transpiration is reduced by means of the physiological processes, which is designed such a way in xerophytic plants. The physiological processes are designed such a way to reduce transpiration. That is the physiological adaptation of the xerophytic plants. So what are the questions you have to learn today? First, the classification. What are the classification based on habitat and the corresponding adaptations? Then morphological adaptation, physiological adaptation and the anatomical adaptations. Today you are going to learn only two, this hydrophytes as well as xerophytes. In the next class, let's continue mesophytes and so on. So draw these two diagrams neatly in the class note and label all the parts and learn all the questions. Prepare 2 mark, 3 mark and 5 mark question wise. Thank you.